still a bit weird about it, but some people have already been very kind, Amanda and Eileen. It's very much appreciated, and it's not set up for me to go and spend it on DVDs and just my own things. It's actually really what's going to end up is it's going to be books, and a lot of the guests that we've had on recently and that we'll probably have on in the future, I'm hoping we'll have books out or even films out, which obviously costs a bit of money. So it'll go towards that, and any kind of equipment that we need, like the ring light, which I definitely need a new one of. As you can see, it's if you're watching on YouTube, you'll see the ring in the network poster behind me. That's because it's broken. But if you buy cheap equipment, that's what you probably get. But so thanks very much for that, and the link to that is in the description on YouTube. It'll be on. It's also in the description box on our Instagram page and also on our Facebook page somewhere. I probably couldn't even find that if I wanted to, even though I put it there. So yeah, if look, there's no pressure. I'm not asking for money off anyone. It's the whole case of if someone is enjoying the podcast and they feel that they're going to throw a few euro our way, that's obviously absolutely brilliant. This is a surprise solo to me more than it is to you, to be honest. But we've seemed to have some sort of a glitch somewhere along the way with our guest who should be on it maybe half an hour ago. I don't know. I think this is one of those ones where there has been a change of time in the US. The daylight savings has changed last night, and the guest could show up in half an hour because they've messed up with the timing. And that's entirely possible. And all I have written in front of me here is questions for that guest. So this is completely off the top of my head, really. And I really don't know what I'm going to talk about because I did a solo last week, and I like to plan the solos out and have some sort of topics that I can discuss and kind of ramble about. And look, I can ramble on like the best of them, but I don't want to kind of cover over. Go over old ground, So I suppose one thing I can talk about. I was up in Dublin last week for a few days, and I had a podcast in the bag and organized that and organized not missing classes that I had to teach or anything like that. So I was able to go to Dublin and I had a really nice time and I could relax a bit and got to go into the city and a couple of runs down by the down by the sea, down by the coast, which is always lovely. But what I did get a chance to do, and with my mum, we went to see the Banshees of Inisherin. And it's funny, I was talking to a friend of mine before, and she said it was terrible. And I had read about it, and I listened to a lot of podcasts. Like I always say, I listen to podcasts about film, and a lot of the people who I respect and I really like, loved it. These critics and stuff loved it. So I was kind of expecting to like it off them because I tend to kind of my ideas are not really my ideas, but my film tastes fall into line with them. So went to it and I thought it was absolutely terrific. I loved everything about it. I thought there was so many standout things about it, and it's one of those ones like I talk about going over films, watching films twice to kind of catch up with the certain aspects of it that you might miss in the first place because you're concentrating on maybe performances or the writing and direction and stuff like that. So first off, the performances were just, I mean, it's funny. I was going to be talking about Colin Farrell in this podcast episode about another performance in another film, and maybe we still will. But Colin Farrell's performance, there's a part very early on in the film where he's sitting opposite Brendan Gleeson, who's also terrific. He plays that role he plays in this very, very well. These two are reunited since In Bruges, which was another absolutely brilliant film, and also a Martin McDonagh film. I don't know why my microphone did that. But so there's a scene where, and this isn't wrecking the film for anyone, spoiling the film, whatever you want to call it. But Brendan Gleeson's character tells him he doesn't want to be friends with him anymore, and the Colin Farrell's expression from smiling, and he's the kind of kind character in the film, and he's, you know, simple enough guy from an island, and tries to be nice and all this kind of stuff, but his heartbreak on his face goes from smiling to heartbreak in it really quickly, but like not in the way that like it's like a silly Marx Brothers kind of a thing, you know, where these emotions are switched on and off real quick. So it's like that kind of, oh, it's funny. He was smiling, and all of a sudden he's got a frown on his face. It wasn't really like that because it was in the eyes as well, which is something that's, I would imagine, very difficult to do. I have nothing to suggest that I know anything about that. But, you know, when you see it on screen, and in the film I was going to be talking about today, um, he's like that too, Colin Farrell. He seems to have this incredible talent to portray sadness with his, you know, his expressions, his features, but his eyes as well. And there's something very believable about him. And it's funny about Colin Farrell because I think Colin Farrell was one of those I went to see when I was like 20 no, would it be 19 maybe. Tigerland was out in the cinema. If people don't know what that is, it's an American film about these recruits on the army base training before they go to the war. So Colin Farrell's in it, and I had no idea who Colin Farrell was at the time. That was this first film that I had seen of him. I had never seen Ballykiss Angel or anything like that. And he plays an American in it, and his American accent, as you will have heard in other films, is particularly good. Um, so I came away from it thinking this guy was great, and kind of, you know, the film didn't really stick with me. I enjoyed it, whatever, but I kind of came away from. I was going to America the next day actually for a few weeks, but I remember kind of thinking that he was really good. And the next time I saw him, he was playing an Irish character, and I was kind of going, "Oh, he's got a great Irish accent." Thinking it was the opposite way, you know. But I think our idea of Colin Farrell as an actor has always been, at the start, people kind of respected him a bit, at the performance he was putting across. Obviously, he's one of those ones that he happens to be blessed with very good looks and features. So, you know, there's a certain aspect of that to it, which is kind of his acting is overlooked a bit, which was said a lot for Brad Pitt when he was younger. I I think Colin Farrell's a better actor than Brad Pitt, but it's the same kind of idea. And it works like with, you know, females as well as male and female. And sometimes the beauty of the person, you know, physically can kind of you can't quite see that brilliance in them in their performances. So yeah, and then I thought when Colin Farrell went, you know, he was seen over in America as the bowsy Irish, you know, rabble rouser out drinking, and you know, the sex tape and all this stuff that came out, and it turned kind of people's opinions because the Irish people don't like to be exhibitionist as such, like especially not for our stars. And as soon as we kind of break out of that role that is expected of us, it's kind of like we kind of disown them a little bit, even though he didn't really do anything wrong major. He just there was something that, you know, we got to disconnect, and he started doing Miami Vice and Minority Report and doing those bigger budget films where I don't know. I guess I kind of lost track of his career a little bit because they wouldn't be my kind of thing. But he seemed to peel it back then. I don't know. I don't know if he had kids. He definitely had a child, but um, he seems to he seemed to dial down a little bit in what he was doing off screen, and all of a sudden this idea of Colin Farrell then as a serious actor was kind of changed for me. He did The Lobster, and I don't know if people have seen it, but it's a Yorgos Lanthimos film, and it's absolutely bizarre and brilliant. But I can't really explain it to you in a podcast this length. I'd have to go on for too long. And then he did The Killing of a Sacred Deer, which is also a Yorgos Lanthimos film. One thing I say about Yorgos Lanthimos is his films are so weirdly acted. It's like he tells. Look, I've heard him talk about this before. Yorgos Lanthimos talk about this before, of how he tries to separate an actor's usual way of performing and break it down into a kind of a what would you describe it? It's kind of like a really 2D kind of. It's the performance isn't 2D, but there's something about the delivery of the character is quite 2D, because even Nicole Kidman's in The Killing of a Sacred Deer as well, playing Colin Farrell's wife, and she's plays that kind of role similar to what Farrell is doing. And all of a sudden, I saw him in those two films, and I saw a completely different character. And in The Lobster, he carried that sadness and that weight in his shoulders, like it was like, I don't like comparing actors to each other, but there's something what I see Montgomery Clift doing where he was able to do that with his eyes, and he could portray 15 different emotions in his eyes alone, and that there haven't been many actors who could do that, but I saw that in Farrell over those two films, and in Bruges, similar as well, like because there's a lot of sadness within his character, but you know, a lot of the funny stuff comes from him as well. But it's not that he's being intentionally funny. I don't know, my phone is going crazy there beside me, but it's not as if, yeah, there's no intention of being funny in the delivery, but it's just funny the way he says it. So going back to the Banshees of Inisherin, Iran, sorry, I would keep saying Inisherin, but it's Inisherin, because it's not a real place. But his performance alongside Brendan Gleeson, who is his usual, like I said, his usual brilliant self. But Barry Keoghan, who was also in The Killing of Sacred Deer, and some people might know his name, but they'll know his face. He's apparently a bit of a bowsy himself off camera, but on camera he's a real like a scene stealer, and he's brilliant in the film. And I can't imagine the Oscars say or the Golden Globes being or whatever the Critics' Choice, all those awards, not nominating Colin Farrell, Barry Keoghan, and Kerry Condon, who plays Colin Farrell's sister in the film. She's incredible too. She kind of at times is kind of the heart of the film. That sounds like a cliche, I know, but she she she's she's kind of the common sense of the film. Like you will know what I mean once you see it. It's whereas everything else around is kind of like just either exaggerated or played down to an extent where I can't really say too much on it, but played down to an extent where you're thinking that that should be exaggerated, but it's not. Um, but uh, but listen, right on cue, we're gonna go. Actually, we're gonna go straight into this. All right, so I'm gonna have to tell Alexander that we're recording. All right, so we're gonna admit Alexander and um see what's happening. But yeah, so I would definitely recommend the film as one to go. You don't have to see in the cinema, but it's one of those ones where the scenery is absolutely incredible. It's one of those ones where Alexander, how are you doing?
Hi,
Listen,
good. My apologies.
no, that's all right. Listen, I'm actually we're actually recording right now, and
Great.
I'll tell you why, right? Because I wasn't sure what the story was, and I was going to send you a message in a little while, but I said, right, I'm going to go for it. And if Alexander comes in, all the better. I started talking about really off the questions that I was going to ask you. I started talking about the Banshees of Inisherin and Colin Farrell's performance in it, and I saw it last week.
Yeah,
And have you seen it
yeah,
yet?
yeah, yeah, yeah. Are you talking about the translation of my work or?
No, the one he's in. It's set in Ireland. And
Ah, okay. I haven't seen it yet.
yeah, I just wanted to talk about it because I'm a big film fan, and obviously I have the translation of your work as a question to come up. So I kind of got into a little bit of a chat about that, but I haven't been recording that long. But listen, thank you very much for joining me.
Oh, it's a pleasure.
I'm
I'm so happy to be talking with you.
I'm very excited for a number of reasons, but obviously for your fiction, your short story collections so far, and where they where they led my mind in a way because there's there's a lot. I mean, there's a lot to take in, and there's so much that I kind of wanted to pick your brain on with regards to those stories because there's so much. But we always start with the same questions, Alexander. And I suppose the first one is could you give us a brief history of your upbringing, please?
Yeah, so I was born in Brooklyn, New York, um, to a Danish mother and American father, and so I was raised both with Danish culture and the Danish language and than American upbringing. And I think a disconnection of from American society,
Mm,
kind of always seeing it through a lens that wasn't, the I spent a lot of time in Denmark and for holidays and seeing the ways of a very different culture, or a very different way of treating, I think, people in the world. A cozier culture, I would argue, than
Mm.
maybe than America has, which has a lot more dogged individualism, and that never sat right for me. And I can see that that plays out in my fiction. Right? And so then grew up in New York, uh, went to college in New York, and then dropped out of college to move all the way to the West Coast and become a chef as I was working on my writing. Worked for many years as a chef, and then went back to college in at the Jack Kerouac School of Disembodied Poetics in Boulder, Colorado, at a Buddhist university, which also where I then studied performance art and creative writing. And that also, I think, influenced my work a lot. This sort of Buddhism perspective, or a deeper perspective of mind and spirituality and consciousness. Um, and so that that kind of brings me to grad school, and that's I studied fiction there, and then became a professor and a writer afterwards.
um Certainly that enlightenment becomes, part of a couple of the stories as well, which were particularly interesting to me. And it's funny when you talk to someone creative, and they start talking a little bit about their upbringing, and you start to hear where certain ideas might have been plucked from and taken, and I'm fascinated by that,
Yeah.
obviously. The other question we always ask is, when did you first become aware of mental health?
It's a good question. I mean, I think probably as a topic, it was connected to experimenting with psychedelics, and then really sort of popping out of my own consciousness to see consciousness and like mental health, and like how am I doing on that level? Obviously I was aware of it before, but this idea of like, okay, there are multiple levels of mental health and consciousness through which there's the emotional sphere, the psychological sphere, the ego sphere, like all these different levels of being. That became very clear suddenly, immediately through I think experimenting with psychedelics, and then from there became very interested in how do we, I think how do we as a society help to create safe environments for people, or healthy environments, or quite the opposite,
Um, the I this is one where when you're reading someone and you're never trying to like put down, you know, guessing what your influences and who your influences were. But when you were, reading when you were younger and started to writing, who were you reading then?
So I started writing in third grade, and it was Stephen King. I was writing horror and reading horror, and just, eating it up. In many ways, I think probably now they would have sent me to the principal in third grade if I was reading Stephen King. But thankfully, back then they just let you do what you what you wanted. And so he was a big influence. I can still see that there's ways that plays out through my work. But then my father was a big reader, and so he was giving me very classic stuff like Chekhov and Somerset Maugham, and I think probably the weirdest thing I was reading was Kafka. Later in high school, I stumbled over Kafka and really loved. Kafka's been a big influence, I would say. And then Tom Robbins and Kurt Vonnegut was given to me, and they were such rule breakers. I didn't know you were allowed to break these rules because I was reading classic fiction. So they shattered, like they were so important to me in understanding the scope of how much I could play in, I guess, weird futures and experimental worlds.
When you talk about that kind of scope and allowing you to branch out into different things and different topics, and you cover so many topics in your work. But Stephen King makes a lot of sense now that you say it, because there is a lot of um maybe horrific ideas, or maybe even the feelings you get from reading your fiction, like the ideas that like avatars, for instance, would be um a huge thing in the future. Like, do you, when you're writing something down, is there ever a moment when you go, that's too far, that's very unlikely to happen, or do you allow yourself to kind of go where your mind takes you?
Yeah, very much I allow myself to go where my mind takes me. And I think I'm going really far in my stories. And then my friends send me links to, like, oh, take a look. Now Whitney Houston's hologram is on tour, or they figured out how to, like, you know, uh, implant memories in mice or something like that. And I say, dear God, this is what I was trying to warn against
Yeah.
is, suddenly I'm just writing realistic fiction instead of sci-fi. Um, so it turns out that a lot of my speculations, even though they were far out to me at the time, is really just kind of like a prophetic vision of where we seem to be going with our technology.
I spoke. I did a solo episode last week, and I spoke about dating apps.
Yeah.
I've had some experiences on them, and I guess so many people have now. But they do come up in your own work. Um, not so much. Have you ever had experience? But the idea of stretching those boundaries of how we see dating apps now, or how they are now, but where they were when they began, there is a huge jump already. They
Yeah.
could kind of go anywhere, and there's kind of a lot at the time that comes through. A lot of the things that come through your work is our lack of touch with people. Like it will
Yeah.
slowly disappear.
Yeah. So there's two stories. I mean, I think in the second collection, Universal Love, I really explore what I consider to be like the hell realms of online dating that most of us have at some point gone through. Um, and so I have a story called Comfort Porn in that collection where dating apps and sex apps have become so advanced that you just like choose your sexual positions and everything ahead of time and you can have sex easily. There's like safety and consent ratings. So then you just like have sex. You don't even have to talk to the person, because you've already like pre-assigned these roles or what you're going to do during the date. And then in that world, the porn that people are watching is this comfort porn, which is just really friendship, people waving and being like, I'm so happy
Mm.
to see you, and throwing a frisbee around because we have lost that contact. And that story came directly out of my experiences with online dating that I found somewhat horrendous. Like
Mm.
you're learning to use the technology where you have to swipe people into the trash.
Yeah.
And to use those well, you have to agree on some moral level that we're not even registering that, like, yeah, sure, people are worth swiping into the trash if they don't meet my specifications. That was kind of appalling, right? Or the experience that many have of like going to the bathroom and then either you or the other person is checking and making plans with somebody else
Yeah.
while like the person's away from the table. That's kind of nuts. And so I looked at that and I thought, okay, how do you take it one step further? Like if you just push what we're doing right now. Another story in that is true love testimonials, where
Mhm.
people are wearing, I suppose, a kind of bodysuit and they're having virtual sex with avatars and they can swap genders and explore that. And they're, delivering their feelings about the new apps and what they would like to do and, how the bodysuit is working. I think we're going to see something like that. I think we're going to move into virtual bodysuits and having sex with each other. And I don't think that's a good thing. I mean, I think that's I think that's going to be problematic for us.
Yeah, like in that story as well. There's like the idea of the frankness and the openness between the couple, and they're talking about like they're going to have sex with this person, and when they put on the bodysuit and stuff like that, and how when you mention in a lot of your fiction about the distance between people, but then it's almost reversed in the fact that they're
Yeah.
so open with each other that it's breaking them apart anyway.
Yeah. Well, this is something that's important to me because, as we talk, you can hear that I have this sort of morality or a kind of, I'm aware that I have a bit of a moral agenda underneath my work. And I'm always very uh, aware of that and trying to subvert that so that my stories will challenge me
Mhm.
to be like, oh, you really think so? Well, let's look at this example. I'm thinking in that true love testimonials of the divorced couple
Yeah.
that then meet each other by accident through their virtual images of who they think they are. And they have a great sex life now where before they didn't. And so then they start questioning, well, is our true identity this
Mm.
virtual aspect of ourselves rather than who we were when we were in person? Um, I don't know what to say about that. That confuses me as an
Yeah.
author. I don't have that answer. And so I'm constantly looking at, well, like, what's the antithesis? Another story is The Year of Nostalgia,
Mm.
where they replace the main character replaces her dead mom with a hologram, ideally to help the father through grief because the dad is, sort of becoming frozen with grief. It helps the father. The hologram helps the father. I don't think it's a good thing for our ability to process grief, but I can't argue with the characters. And so I'm always looking at ways to complicate my own thesis, I suppose, that's in there.
Yeah, and another thing, because it's such a hot topic, I suppose, and when we talk about climate change and how the world could come to an end, at any moment, really. But the climate
Yeah.
change comes up in a number of a number of ways and stories, and it's you talk about the predictions that you're making, and obviously reading the first book that came out a few years ago. Uh, it's already starting to echo what you're, like you said, it's already starting to echo what you're saying just by looking at, and I know this has got to do with like looking at the scientists and believing what they're saying, and this is going to happen in 5 years, 10 years down the road. But it does give me a great amount of
Yeah.
anxiety, and I think your stories were excellent at portraying that and bringing that anxiety out of me.
Yeah, right. I mean, I have that anxiety too. This is uh, and part of that is balancing that anxiety with humor, right? So if we take the story Ice Age in the first collection, where there's this new ice age and everybody's frozen, except the survivors, and then you have the single igloos of the poor people and the one double-decker rich igloo, and um, you know, that's a certainly a worrisome world. And yet, even in that small community of the so-called, the poor people in the single igloos, there's that disco igloo that the guy
Mm.
starts with like the iPod and like welcomes everybody in and they dance together. So I'm, part of that is my belief in humanity that even during all of this crisis, again and again, we see incredible acts and sometimes surprisingly humorous acts of humanity. I'm thinking about the pandemic here and
Hmm.
um, that trumpet solo, from Italy, that beeping for
Yeah,
this beautiful trumpet solo. And then you also look at somebody like Mark Rebellier, who and performed live improvisational DJ sets on YouTube and got millions of followers. I never
yeah.
would have expected someone in their underwear would be jamming out online. Like it's so humorous and unexpected the way that our humanity shows up.
It absolutely is, and yeah, like I said, there was so much to do with the universal problems that remain, regardless of where your head is at with thinking of what could happen in the future and the speculation of what might happen in the future. All those problems like loneliness and longing and anxiety
Yeah.
seem to remain, and that was, I guess, that amongst it
Mm.
all was the thing that stood out to me more. All these kind of human universal problems will always be there.
Yeah, that's a big piece of my work. The I tend to call the work speculative fiction rather than
Mhm.
sci-fi only because I don't dive into the scientific background of any of this stuff. Like many of these technological pieces, uh, that's just the background. That's the premise of which informs the story, but the real story is about how do we love each other, or we go through breakups, and what do we do in a world where we're communicating psychically through our technology and we break up rather than through words? Or how do we raise kids when our kids disappear online? How do we find them online? These are just metaphors for what we're dealing with, as a parent who has teenagers that absolutely disappear into YouTube videos and online
Yeah.
constantly. It's just a metaphor for that. And so the human experiences and emotions for me, have to take the forefront. Otherwise, the story doesn't kind of get off the ground.
Yeah, and I appreciate the idea of not like where it's a lot of people will love the science jargon to be all there and everything, and that for me would be probably a bit too much. Do you see like a maturity in your writing from the first book uh, into Universal Love?
Yeah, I think I'm somehow starting to like deepen
Mhm.
uh, into the characters more. Uh, I was obviously deep in characters in Children of the New World, um, but there's also like a wildness. Like there's a lot of sex, for example, in Children of the New World, and I can see that like that was me really like breaking the rules and having fun and being like, okay, can I really go here in this? You're talking about the limits, and I was pushing that. Um, I feel like I'm doing that less in Universal Love, where I'm just sort of sinking more into, okay, well, who are these characters? Um, and also, what do they do now that they've accepted? The transition between these two is like Children of the New World was warning, saying, let's not go there. The technology is on the horizon. Let's not do it. Universal Love says, well, we embraced
Yeah,
technology. We're there. Now, what do we do? And so for me, the deepening is like that brings us up to where we are now, where we have embraced technology. How do we find love within
yeah,
this? Or and not just romantic love, how do we find that with our neighbors? How do we find it friendship again? I think that's a big theme right now where we do see kind of factionalism happening and much more disconnection. Um, that's for me the deepening of this sort of human exploration of my work.
Alexander, allow me 1 minute to read out an advert because you know
Yeah.
yourself, these things have to be done. Um, I'm surprised there wasn't a story just about advertising, and maybe there was. But anyway, right. So, Fusion Training Center, Monksland Athlone, a place to train in Brazilian Jiu Jitsu, kickboxing, martial arts, and CrossFit. A great atmosphere with experienced coaches and a real sense of community. If you want to join the team, find us on Facebook at Fusion Training Center or drop in for a chat. Fusion Training Center, train like a warrior. So, Alexander, something like After Yang, how does something like that get greenlit, and made into a film?
Well, some of that is a mystery to me because I'm not on the inside of that piece of it. But the way it starts is, in this case, through my film agent. The book got into the hands of Kogonada, but interestingly enough, because I have a number of other stories that are in development, it can come into the hands of a director or a screenwriter or an actor in all kinds of ways. Through just picking it up or a friend recommends it has happened. So at that point they reach out and then we one options the film and then they go through various levels of trying to get the funding for that, right, and finding sometimes they're already connected to a studio, other times they have to sell that, they have to write the script ahead of time or things like that. Um, when then that moves into the next stage, uh, at that point, so I was in the case of After Yang, I was involved at different steps of that.
Okay.
Once it had been optioned, Kogonada came out, and they were actually going to originally film in Detroit, near where I live. And so I invited him to dinner, and he came over, and he sort of checked out where I lived because he's a very atmospheric
Mm-hmm.
director. And there's a lot of green, and so there's a lot of green in the movie. And I'd just come back from China and served tea with leaves floating, and there's
Okay.
leaves floating, so there's all these like kind of amazing things from my own life that ended up showing up visually. And then after dinner, we sat and talked about the changes that he was proposing, an expansion, because the movie has maybe 70% new material
Mm-hmm.
from the story, and asked me my thoughts on it. And I said, I think it's brilliant. I think, I'm not an author that's very tightly held, like it has to be
Right.
like a story. In fact, I really admire the brilliance of directors that can expand that. And I thought he did that so beautifully. And then next time I saw him was on set with the characters. I saw Yang, who in the story breaks down. Here was Yang
Yeah.
alive again, shaking my hand. It was really a wild, wild experience.
Um, there's one thing about the film that was stunning, and it's funny you mentioned about the greens and stuff. The production design in that film it's kind of unlike anything I've seen for quite a while, and um, he is a very visual director, and of course the performances that which we'll talk about a bit as well. But that's interests me about the story because having read the short story itself and then seeing the film, the where the characters go from there, it does take quite um a big jump from where you kind of leave off, I guess. But uh, you obviously you liked it. You thought it was worth the time. Like,
Absolutely. I thought it was
yeah.
a really beautiful film. I mean, he so captures the heart of the characters and of the story, and that kind of emotional heart. So yeah,
I was just before he came on, I was just talking about Colin Farrell, our very own Colin Farrell. But
yeah,
and what interests me about Colin Farrell is his trajectory from in Ireland in particular. He was up here and then he went down here, and then he went
mm,
back up here. And in recent times, he's an actor who holds sadness in his eyes, unlike anyone I've seen for a long time. And in the
yeah,
role he plays in After Yang, he is absolutely brilliant.
yeah. I agree. I mean, I'm so struck by some of these scenes where there's so little that is being said,
Mm-hmm.
actually, in his acting. I'm thinking of one scene where he admits at the table that he misses Yang too.
Mm-hmm.
And you see him sort of listening to the conversation, and then he spits it out, and it's this like deeply held, sad truth of his grief. Um, it just breaks your heart, and so I agree. I think he's brilliant in that, in playing the father of Yang, here,
Mm-hmm.
Jake, his character.
I came away from After Yang, like with glad obviously I saw the film, but with a kind of heavy heart because of what happens and not expecting what was going to happen, after
Mm,
the short story and into the film. But I think if we just go back to what happens in the short story, the idea of an AI, passing or breaking down really, and the family missing them so much. But what you did in it's a short story. Like it's not one of those, because sometimes short stories are quite long. If you look at it, 50
yeah, right.
pages, they're kind of like novellas more. But what you did within that to kind of bring, like we talked before, that kind of sadness, longing, anxiety, things like that into it, I found that amazing. When you come away from a piece like that, um, is there like a eureka thing, or is that just a romantic idea of a writer?
No, very much so, especially because that story, Saying Goodbye to Yang, which is the first story in the first collection, was also the first story that broke me out of a kind of, I suppose, I was still playing around with realism until
Mm-hmm.
then, maybe a David Foster Wallace style realism or something like that. And I began writing this story about a robot that breaks down and the father who wants to repair it. And I was going into this like cliche business character that I wanted to do, and this little bit in my mind said, "You're not going to do that crap again." Uh, and so I was like, "Okay, what shall I do?" And the thought came, "Well, make the dad like you." I was a young father at the time who loves his child and wants the best. And at that point, I didn't know, I no longer had a plot. All I knew was I had a broken robot on my hands. And so I started writing as first person, I'm writing this character that needs to bring the robot along. Through that, I ended up writing about fatherhood, about my judgments of neighbors and our pettiness, about racism, about the emotional connections or disconnections we can have in our lives. All of that was a eureka because I wasn't planning any of it out. It was all surprises. And I thought I'd finished the story, and I was driving along, and it was a fall day, and the leaves were raining down, and all of this. And then suddenly I was like, "Oh, we need a funeral, of course," which is the ending scene,
Yeah,
in the and an important scene for the story, that they would bury this robot. In many ways, being a very weird family. It'd be
yeah.
the equivalent of like going outside and burying your laptop is what they're doing. Um, and yet that's such a heartfelt scene. So all of that, these eureka moments for me are very important in the drafting process. I'm looking for that moment where I'm
Yeah.
surprised.
It's so when you write now, is it always the idea of speculative fiction, or is there still a kind of a window that might lead you to maybe literary fiction, like you mentioned, David Foster Wallace style?
I do a lot of it's kind of everything. I'm open
Mm.
to it all right now. I'd say previously I always said that I couldn't write realism, because if I try to do it, it comes out very cliche and kind of Hallmark card, like I really like my family, and
Yeah.
it's just dead on the page. But if I do a bank shot through virtual children or something like that, I can do it. I'm working on a new novel now that really just has the thinnest layer of speculative fiction. Basically, that the Earth will cease at some point, within a year, actually. And then everything else, it turns out to be how we act if we knew that we had a year left, and the various interactions, and that deals with getting kids to school or deciding maybe we should take them out and
Yeah.
buy, a trip to like spend all our money and just live in Punta Cana or something like that. Um, and I'm watching that and just being like, okay, okay, I think I'm writing realism. I think I'm almost writing realism. and
Yeah.
trying not to like psych myself out. So I do things like that. The other realm that I work in is magical realism. And
Mhm.
so writers like Italo Calvino and Borges have been very influential. And there I'm working on a tour guide to a continent that we simply missed. And who knows
Okay.
why we missed it, but there it
Yeah.
is. And so here's the tour guide, and there's hotels that can eat you, and
Oh,
cities of loneliness where you show up and nobody will say hi to you, but everybody else is having a great time. And so
right.
I play with a lot of different genres.
So what's the approach then? What's the different approach between short stories and a novel? How does that work?
Yeah, I think the basic piece that determines for me whether it's going to be a short story or a novel is the complexity of the conflict. And so and I suppose the cast of characters is another important piece. So for me, a short story tends to be able to handle one conflict that's relatively concise, maybe two. It may have a sub level or a super level of conflict going on. Um, and that's what I do in all my short stories. But then, as I started working on a novel, I realized, oh, okay, well, if I have a planet and a lot of people that are dealing with that, could I condense that? Sure, I could see pushing all that down, but there's so much more expansion there. And one of the, I think, the joys and dangers of the novel is it's such a malleable form. It can expand. It's an expanding membrane. You want
Mm.
300-page novel? You want a 1,000-page novel? Um, and the danger of that, so early on, I was like, it's like a kid in a candy shop. I'm like, I can put this in, I can put this in. And then I realized, oh, well, unless I want to war and peace, I'm really
Yeah.
going to have to start selecting thematically how many stories I can tell. The other piece I'd say is that editing short stories is way more pleasurable for me than editing a
Yeah.
novel because you can get a story edited in like a day. A
Yeah.
novel is just endless, endless editing.
Yeah, I can imagine that. All right. Here's a question that I this is probably being fair to throw it at you now, but of all your other stories, which one would you think would make a good film?
The cartographers,
Hmm.
and as I say this, I should also say that these are ones that have been optioned, so they are in
Okay.
development, which is really exciting. Like the cartographers is in development. I see that as being a really exciting uh, one. The other one is Islanders. This one is one
Hmm.
that isn't hasn't been optioned yet, where the world is a world that's been flooded,
Hmm.
and there's a father and son on this. Wherever the elevation was high enough, they exist up there, and they've got diving tanks, and so they're sort of scavenging the world below and trying to live there. That story really ends on a cliffhanger, I would say.
Hmm.
It ends at really just the opening of yet another story. And so there's a way that that story would naturally open into television or film.
I think Children of the New World would be a fascinating idea for a film because that's a devastating story, and um
Yeah.
the idea of not being able to have children, but then having the online children, as it were, and I'm not going to go too into it because people will be reading it, and but that to me stay to me. a long time after reading. It got me thinking about, not so much thinking about how we could develop it. That wasn't my mindset, but just the idea of that happening to a couple after not being able to have kids and then having kids and then having to do something about that again. It's just it was it was one of those ones, yeah, that just it'll probably stay with me for a while. And I love those. I tried to buy those the books like the 100 greatest American short stories or all those kind of things. And I think
Yeah, yeah.
that's one of those ones that would fit in there perfectly because it's such a
Mm.
hard hitting story, you know. Well, there's a lot of them, but so like aside from all the writing, what do you like to do in your spare time?
Well, I should just tell you that Children of the New World is one of the stories that's optioned and in development. So the dream is hopefully going to come true by right now it's in development with Lulu Wang, who made The Farewell, a really
Brilliant,
fantastic director.
brilliant.
And so it's going to be very exciting to see where she takes that
Oh,
story.
that's great news, and the farewell is such a good film as well.
Yeah.
You know, so sorry, um, what do you like to do in your spare time, Alexander?
I mean, I love nature, and
Mm.
so hiking, kayaking, being in nature, um, being with my family, spending time with my wife, who is also has her roots from Ireland. I
Oh,
should
really?
mention, yeah, yeah, and so she was very excited, that I was doing this podcast as am I. Um, until family time, I think music, I don't do it as much as I used to, but I like to play piano
Okay.
and guitar. Uh, and that's for me such a great like release because being surrounded by words so
Mm.
much, it's nice to just move into the musical landscapes that you can
Yeah.
create, and you can really play with emotion in a beautiful way through music. Um, that's much more fluid than having to work with words.
Can you listen to music when you're writing?
Yeah, tend not to be able to use music with words.
Yeah.
But instrumental music, absolutely. And in fact, I used heart opening music, like a certain kirtan and um, specifically like spiritual or ceremonial music for some of the scenes where I really needed my
Okay.
heart to be opened and I want that tone. And so I find that different music will affect the way that I then have access to word choice.
Um, I used to write a little bit, you know, just kind of playing around with short stories actually. But I tried. I wrote this novel when I had a breakdown years and years ago, and this is where my interest in mental health came from and kind of
Mm-hmm.
progressed. But I think at the time I didn't see the novel as what it was, which was a therapeutic, cathartic, you know, release, really,
Yeah.
and it was about that breakdown. But I used to try and listen to music when I was writing, and I'd have my little stereo speakers, and I was really into Bob Dylan at the time,
Yeah.
and like you can't have Bob Dylan on when you're writing because like talk about the amount of words he can fit in a song, especially like his
Yeah.
first decade that he was on the scene. But I did try that, then changing to classical music, and you know there was something in me that kind of went, who do I think I am listening to classical music? It was just that's the Irish mentality right there, that like why you know we should be listening to something a bit more, you know, up our own street rather than like you know,
Uh,
something that's kind of far out there. But I would say that I didn't think of those that spiritual side that would be not only you know good for the mind, easy to listen to when you're writing, but the relaxation, because sometimes I found when I was writing about, which was essentially about myself in the novel, it kind of made me a little bit anxious because you're always kind of thinking, am I putting too much of myself in here?
yeah. It's a really interesting piece because I risk a lot of vulnerability in myself and my work. In fact, I'm constantly giving my characters me and
Mm,
things that I love and fear and the anxieties. I'm giving it to that. Um, Particularly if I have a bad character, if I have a character that I could easily damn on the page, it's very important for me to give them something that I either admire, that I don't feel like I can do, but I admire it, or something that's very important to me. Then they become human, and I can't sacrifice them for my plot. Uh, and that question of like, when am I going over, like
mm,
that you're talking about? is interesting. I think it becomes difficult in editing because you're editing yourself out, right? And
Yeah,
so it's like, being careful of not, or a kind of egomania where I'm like, here's the great character who has my heart, and
yeah,
being very careful of like glorifying that. I think, again, with saying goodbye to Yang, the main character is very much me.
mm,
I have judgments just like that character of Neighbors, and but
mhm,
it's then I'm also making fun of myself,
yeah,
because I can see that, oh well, it's my small-minded judgments that keep me isolated often.
yeah.
Um, yeah,
I also think that the handing off of the piece to and it went to my parents, either of my parents, and I was straight away thinking they're going to know that that bit's about me
yeah,
and that bit, and that was a little bit of a worry for me. And if they knew, like obviously they know me more than anyone, but maybe other people might be able to pick it out, and then it becomes like people aren't reading a novel; they're reading a diary.
yeah, yeah. Well, that's it brings up a couple pieces for me. I've been reading Knausgaard,
Hmm.
Knausgaard,
Hmm.
who wrote My Struggle and wrote this, enormous, and he is so blunt. You read what he writes and you say, my God, you're saying everything about your mother-in-law, your wife, how you feel about your kids, that you don't like your kids sometimes. Um, and that's refreshing and shocking, because that's just like pure dumping of your feelings into there, and unabashed. In this realistic novel, or the more realistic novel that I'm working on, I find that I'm really pulling from my life. And I have that worry now. I never had that
Yeah,
before, because I could hide it so much
yeah,
better under, like, nobody's going to be like, oh, I'm the robot or something.
yeah,
I can kind of hide all that. But to do it, and the fear of burning bridges,
mm.
there's that fear too of like, will this person be hurt? Um, but I don't think that should stop us from writing.
No,
Yeah. No, I'm interested in what you think of that. Yeah.
no, it absolutely shouldn't. But I I don't know if you get this. I'm sure you do. It was the idea that okay, so I've written about myself, but the other characters I like to think have come out of thin air, but they
Yeah.
haven't really, because there's always something that we pull from a person we know here, the person we know there. And then I got to thinking, like, what if they eventually read it and whether they see that something is about them or they think that it's about them, that it mightn't have anything to do with them. It's
Mhm.
such a complicated, you talked about editing. That's probably the hardest part of it.
Yeah. Well, in my case, I wrote a lot about love. I had this question where somebody said, how much are these relationships based on people you knew, in front of a crowded
Yeah.
auditorium? And so, but the truth is, every single relationship in there is a part of a relationship I had. And so I am writing about past partners or lovers in my work, and both the good and the bad there. I'm also writing about, the character in The Cartographers, Quimbley, who is a rather
Mhm.
sociopathic character. That's based on a friend that I had who was
Right.
very manipulative. And so I took that, but he was also brilliant. He was like
Mm.
sort of brilliant manipulative. And I admired the brilliance and hated the manipulation. And I just grabbed that and I put it right into the character. Um, which is to say, I don't mind damning characters if they were bad in real life to me.
Yeah.
There's a little bit of like, haha, okay, we're going to put that right in there because that's the truth, at least
Yeah.
my emotional truth of what I experienced.
But there's also it works the complete opposite way when we have someone in our lives who are, everything that we want in our lives. That person who
Yeah,
just holds us up, and I have a few of them, where you can put them into work as a kind of a dedication as such.
very much so. Yeah, and I think that's a beautiful thing.
Yeah.
Especially because they don't mind if they're being glorified.
Yeah.
That's an easier sell.
It does make it a little bit easier. But listen, Alexander, it's been a joy chatting to you. It's been a lot of fun. And thank you for your openness.
Oh, always. Yeah. Thanks so much for inviting me on. I really enjoyed speaking with you too. It feels like we could talk for a long time.
Oh, we absolutely could. Alexander, if you don't mind just sticking with me for a minute, I'll finish this off. I'll take a quick photo for the archives, and then we'll go on our way if that's all right.
Sounds
Brilliant.
great.
Brilliant. So I also need to thank John for his tech savviness. I always thank my mum, my dad, my granddad, Jer and Calvin for doing the music and the logos and stuff like that. Subscribe to our YouTube channel if you would. We're on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter. Obviously, check out Alexander Weinstein's work, Children of the New World and Universal Love. And also go and have a look at After Yang. It's actually here. It's available on Sky right now on Sky Movies, and it's absolutely worth your time. So yeah, like I said, we're also on Anchor, Spotify, Apple, Google Podcasts, etc. Thank you everyone for watching or listening or whatever way you took this episode in. And once again, Alexander, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
Brilliant. Everyone else, have a lovely week and see you next one. Bye.